testosterone, we have a problem.
This is Outside the Manosphere, where two guys grow their bromance,
non-toxic bromance,
their non-toxic bromance, by exploring masculinity, manosphere culture, and joy in the stupidest timeline.
Join us.
Welcome to Outside the Manosphere. I'm Skip.
And I'm Carlos.
Our main topic today is men and breakups and the way they deal with them. For that, we're going to talk to Michael J. Wilson, a research fellow at Movember's Institute of Men's Health, who specializes in men's health and relationships. So, enjoy.
Michael Wilson, thank you for joining us. You are a research fellow at Movember, yes?
So at the moment, I am a full-time research fellow in men's health and relationships here at Movember, but I'm also currently finishing my PhD at the moment, which is through the University of Melbourne. And that work is the kind of bulk of the research I've done focusing on men's risk of suicide in the context of relationship breakdown. And so now here at Movember, I'm kind of continuing some of that work, looking at the connections more broadly between men's mental health and the health of their relationships, be they intimate relationships or social connections, any sort of relationship health. Because we know that, being socially connected, having good quality relationships is really critical to our health and well-being. So I feel really privileged and excited to kind of continue working in this space. So yeah, that's me.
And so in your research, you found everything's great. We don't need to worry about anything. Men's relationships and all that. Everything's perfect. Just don't say anything, right?
As I'm sure folks would expect, everything is pretty good. There's just a few kind of little, huge societal issues that need some serious attention. So, yes, lots of work to be done. And in many ways, the work of my PhD very much kind of scratched the surface of, so many huge and complex questions that, I could probably spend my entire career trying to answer. So, yeah, just so glad I get to continue doing this work now with Movember.
Well, what got you interested in the subject and what brought you to Movember?
So I guess a combination of, my own lived experience of mental health challenges, also supporting friends with really complex mental health issues. And, in a lot of ways, like friends of mine have come close to attempting suicide, particularly in the context of relationship issues. And so that, I think, really pushed me towards wanting to study this issue because I have really felt the discomfort of not knowing how best to support someone and what to say in that context and how difficult that can be. And I think the difficulty with not knowing how to support someone, I think it applies regardless of gender, but there are some really unique contexts of that sort of interpersonal support that can make it more difficult when trying to support the men in our lives. I think in a lot of ways, we sometimes, if the way a guy is showing up in really intense distress, if that kind of conflicts with our understanding or expectation of the way that men, should be and the way that they should handle their distress and everything, it can really lead to some discomfort of not knowing what to say and how best to support them. So I guess I really wanted to, focus on this risk factor to really try and understand on a practical level, like what can we actually do to better support guys in the context of relationship breakdown? Because I think peer support and social connection is a really key lever that can be pulled really to prevent suicide in this context. So that's kind of the personal level, but then just on a kind of academic level in looking at the research that was out there focusing on this risk factor, the vast majority tended to look at the question of whether men or women are at greater risk of suicide in the context of relationship breakdown and really group all men together relative to all women and just try and understand who's more at risk, which is an interesting question. But as a researcher in men's suicide prevention, it's really not all that informative because it inherently treats all men as the same. It lumps all men together and means that we have very little understanding of the unique kind of potential risk factors that might emerge in the context of relationship breakdown for some men, and equally in the context of relationship breakdown for women. Like this sort of gender differences approach is just not all that informative in terms of unique risk factors for individual genders. And so that was kind of the main rationale behind my research in this space, really trying to delve into men as a group and try and understand, thousands of people go through separation and divorce every year, which men are actually most at risk and what factors actually play a role in that risk of suicide. So yeah, it was kind of a combination of academic and personal connection to wanting to focus on this topic.
I see also, so I do want to come back at some point to the comparison between women suicides after relationship breakdowns versus sounds weird, but you know what I mean, with men. But I also wanted to ask you, you've got a few other publications. One of them is Operationalizing Positive Masculinity. And then you have another, The Antisocial Network, the role of the social media app, Manosphere in young men's lives. And then another one is just social media and youth mental health. Are they all sort of like male leaning as far as research goes? Or why did you choose men over any other topic or any other group?
I suppose initially I started doing research looking at youth sport and mental health, so developing training for sporting coaches around how to better support young people with their mental health and in sport. And that kind of naturally led me towards studying gender differences and looking at what's going on for young men in particular contexts, because we know that sport is a really key lever for mental health promotion in young men. Movember has a lot of amazing programs delivered through youth sport, like Ahead of the Game, for example, is a kind of world-leading mental health literacy program for young men delivered through sport. So I think initially that's kind of how I started to get interested in, gender differences and just the role of masculinity and masculine socialization in the mental health of boys and young men and men across the lifespan, really. The piece on positive masculinity was a really interesting project we did with a school here in Melbourne, essentially trying to understand and I guess put a bit of a framework to this concept of positive masculinity, because so much research out there is looking at essentially the association between traditional masculine norm adherence and different health outcomes in boys and men. And what we mean by traditional masculine norm adherence is really rigid adherence to potentially outdated models of masculinity defined by purely self-reliance, stoicism, emotion restriction, all these sorts of norms. And so the implicit kind of, assumption in a lot of that research is that if we can broaden the conception of masculinity and broaden the, models of manhood against which boys and men are socialized, then maybe that will help, alleviate discomfort seeking help in the context of distress and mean that boys and men are more likely to reach out when they need it and things like that. But we hadn't really seen in the literature any kind of research actually aiming to put a framework to this kind of concept of positive masculinity and actually try and define it and sort of say what it looks like. And so that was a kind of theoretical piece trying to bring together different kind of schools of thought to try and define it. And I guess the definition we came up with was around three key domains being connection, motivation, and authenticity. And so connection being like positive, relationships and healthy relationships, both with self and other people. Motivation in terms of, deep intrinsic motivation to contribute meaningfully to society and kind of the world at large. And authenticity in terms of comfort in seeking help when needed and kind of dropping, the so-called mask of masculinity when needed in order to seek help. And so that work has now, I think, informed a lot of research that Movember is doing now that I'm not directly involved with, but I'm sort of supporting, which is focused on developing an index of what we call healthy manhood now. So trying to, measure what healthy manhood looks like across all different domains in terms of, physical health, mental health, help seeking, relationship quality, all these different domains that we know, make up what it means to be a healthy man. So we're actually doing some work across countries, essentially trying to develop a new measure so that we can understand the extent to which healthy conceptions of manhood are related to men's health and not just quote unquote unhealthy or really rigid adherence to outdated traditional norms. So yes, there's been a lot of different random things I've done across the years, but it all kind of feeds into one another. And I feel really lucky to have worked in this space for a long time.
Yeah, I've found that as we've gotten deeper and deeper into the subject, now that we're in our second season, I have been really surprised at how interesting this kind of research has been. And we've talked with Dr. Pete Fisher from Movember as well. And just like it's something that I really didn't think I was going to have that much interest in when we started, but it's really been fascinating. And I love talking to guys like you and learning about this stuff. Carlos, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to comment on how, when you were describing the positive masculinity, how satisfying it must be to see your research actually in action and being used for further research.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is really exciting to see how different, like that, the positive masculinity piece, we did in, I think, 2021, 22. And then, so now it's some years later that I've come to studying breakups and suicide risk in young men. So it is really cool to see how kind of different thinking and different research that we've done across the years now kind of all feeds into one another. And I think it just really highlights how important it is, I think, more broadly, just for researchers to collaborate and to bring different perspectives to one another, because so much can be learnt from, different ways of thinking, different, I guess, disciplines in terms of understanding men's mental health, because so many different issues cut across so many different disciplines. And I think only through collaboration and sharing of knowledge across disciplines are we actually going to understand how to address these big issues. And so, for example, my research over the last few years has kind of drawn on insights from epidemiology, psychiatry, psychology, public health, suicide prevention, intimate partner violence prevention, all these different kind of fields in their own right. I've tried to kind of distill the different insights from across them to try and paint a complex but ideally, holistic picture of men's risk of suicide in the context of relationship breakdown. So yes, it's been really cool to bring it all together and move forward now.
Go ahead, Skip.
Oh, I was just going to get into kind of the meat of men's relationships and the relationship to breaking up and suicides. What are the risk factors that you found? And what kind of things are men using? What kind of mechanisms are men using to get through breakups, whether healthy or unhealthy, or as coping mechanisms? Tell us about what you found.
So maybe I'll speak a bit about the big kind of global evidence review I did to start with, and then I can move into talking about the grounded theory study I did. But the initial kind of study I did was a global evidence review of essentially all the research that was out there looking at relationship breakdown and men's risk of suicide. And so that was a meta-analysis of 75 studies from across 30 countries globally, and the total population reflected in that sample was over 106 million men. So it's the biggest study of its kind that had been done. And as I said earlier, most of the research that had been done was trying to compare men's risk relative to women's. But this review really wanted to delve into men as a group and try and understand who's most at risk and what factors actually play a role in that risk. And so generally what we found was, not unexpectedly, relationship breakdown was a universal risk factor for suicide. We found that separated men were up to 5 times more likely to die by suicide than their married peers. And that risk really skyrocketed in men under 35. So separated men under 35 years of age were up to 9 times more likely to die by suicide than their married peers. So again, highlighting that potentially younger men who might be going through separation at a time where their peers aren't necessarily doing so, I think would potentially speak to it being a really isolating and distressing experience. And so moving more towards understanding the different factors involved in that risk and what seems to play a role, there's kind of a few different factors at play, but the two main ones that came up, firstly, was just the really intense emotional upheaval of relationship breakdown. It might sound self-explanatory, but I think there's really something to be said for, I think, the emotional crisis that is a breakup in many ways. And I think for a lot of men, it leads to such a state of dysregulation, agitation, just a total feeling that everything has come crashing down and they have no way out of this distress, which when coupled with the fact that the main way that distress is regulated in a relationship is typically with our intimate partner, especially I think in heterosexual relationships where some men might be inclined to lean on their partner, as a primary avenue of social and emotional support. So when you couple really intense emotional distress with the sudden absence of the main avenue through which that distress is typically regulated, it creates a pretty risky picture in terms of the idea of suicide kind of coming into focus for some guys as the only option for actually silencing this really intense pain that feels like it's never ending. So yes, that was kind of the main one. And then there was some sort of indirect evidence for that came up through some studies showing that shame was a mediator in the pathway from relationship breakdown to suicidal thoughts, for example, which I think, shame is a really intense negative emotion linked to feelings of low self-worth and feeling like you are inherently wrong as a person. And I think what that says to me is that for some guys, potentially their intimate relationship is a key source of self-worth and identity. And, especially for guys that might be the main provider in the family, a key source of purpose and self-worth and everything can come from our relationships. And so when they break down, it's understandable that shame can arise as a really intense aversive emotional consequence. So I think when you couple the emotional upheaval with the sudden absence of support with, some really difficult emotions in shame and isolation and all these sorts of things, so the emotional component was really strong. So that was the first main one. The second main kind of domain of risk factors that seem to play a role is really the interpersonal connection element in terms of social isolation and loneliness coming up as key factors that can differentiate risk of suicide following relationship breakdown, which I think is really important, again, as I alluded to earlier, in the context where, some men might be inclined or might be really blindsided by a breakup if they don't sort of realize that they've been primarily relying on their partner, potentially, unwillingly at the expense of connections outside of that relationship. Whereas when we know, generally it's a bit of a stereotype, but I think it rings true to an extent that women are more likely to kind of maintain social connections outside of their intimate relationship. And so again, if the relationship breaks down, some men lose not only their primary emotional support, but also suddenly they realize that they've got no one to turn to and they're struck by, the emotional upheaval alongside isolation and loneliness and, sensibly no one to turn to for support. So yes, the two main kind of broad categories of risk factors was really the emotional upheaval and the interpersonal isolation piece. And these sorts of risk factors had been kind of alluded to in previous research, but I guess this was the first time we'd really, highlighted these two things as really important to pay attention to. For me, it was really important to do so because it highlights opportunities for intervention. We might not be able to prevent the relationship breakdown itself, and in many ways we shouldn't. Like, I don't think anyone should be in a relationship that's unhealthy or isn't, meeting their needs in whatever way. And so if we can just help people to better regulate their emotions, for example, or better, know who to turn to or know how to seek help in the context of a breakup, and equally, if we can make sure that people supporting men know what to say and know how to kind of ameliorate their distress, then that, ideally will interrupt the pathway to suicide for some men. And so that is kind of the broad 30,000 foot view with that initial piece of research. And then that kind of led me towards the interview-based study I did with young men. But I guess before I get into that, I just wanted to see if you wanted to expand any more on any of those points I raised.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, these sort of things to look for in, how a man's reacting to a breakup. This is about relationship breakdown, right? So it's not necessarily like they were broken up with, you know what I mean? It's just an ending of a relationship. So just because somebody maybe did the dumping doesn't mean that they're okay. It means that they're still suffering this loss of identity and of support. And whether they initiated it or not, it's still something to not dismiss and to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and one that has come up quite a bit in terms of like, are the people that end the relationship or decide to end things better off than those that are dumped? And again, it's a really important question when we know that I think something like, I'm potentially going to get this wrong off the top of my head, but the majority of divorces in heterosexual relationships are initiated by women. How initiation of divorce is defined, I don't know, but there is some research that's kind of supporting that. Generally, what I found is some evidence that those that are broken up with are more at risk. So potentially because for those that are doing the dumping have kind of commenced the grieving process earlier on. So they may be through a lot of the really intense pain. But what's kind of complicating that is that most of the research looking into that question tends to just focus on the emotional upheaval following a breakup as the outcome that they're studying. Very few studies have actually looked at whether, people who are broken up with are more likely to report suicidal thoughts after a breakup versus not, for example. So yeah, that question had been looked into a little bit, but not to sort of sufficient depth. But yeah, to answer your question, it seems to me that regardless of whether you're dumped or doing the dumping, it doesn't mean that you're kind of immune just because you might have initiated or wanted the relationship to end.
I think so. A couple things like what you said about younger men specifically being at risk, and also what Carlos was saying about whether someone was dumped or the dumpy or dumper or the dumpy or however we want to put that. But yeah, I mean, I think like I've been in that situation where when I was a teenager, and I had a really hard time after I broke up with somebody. And part of it is just that youth, right? Like we just don't know how to deal with shit. And like there's a whole bunch of emotions. And especially if, you came from an environment where men don't have those multiple masculinities to look at and don't have those positive ways of dealing with things, like you just kind of spiral in yourself. So like, I think, yeah, even if somebody is the dumper, just like not having the age and the experience or the outlets to kind of deal with those things can be really rough. But I also wanted to shout out some of the things that you were talking about, like we've talked about on the show, is part of this dysregulation is because they were in this man-keeping relationship where they've been relying on their partner. Because our listeners that have listened for a long time might know this term. This is kind of what you were describing, where the men are relying solely on their partner for a lot of this emotional support and stuff like that. And that goes, part and parcel, I think, with what you were saying about isolation. Those things go hand in hand, don't they?
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's a really important kind of context to pay attention to, because it shows that there's so many potential opportunities to intervene earlier, like to actually build up the health and the quality of men's relationships and really the equity of those relationships, so that if things break down, like men, some guys aren't totally left blindsided and totally left with no one to turn to because they suddenly realize the extent to which they'd been relying on their partner. So yeah, that's something I'd love to look into further, is try and understand, longitudinally, for example, to what extent does the kind of equity or equality of men's relationships in terms of emotional, reciprocity, to what extent does that predict risk once relationships end? It'd be a really hard thing to study because those relationships that are better quality are inherently less likely to end. So it's kind of, it would be complex, but yeah, a really important part of the story as well.
Yeah. And I imagine there's probably, because we've also talked about other things on the show, Carlos, like weaponized incompetence and things. So it's not just that emotional support, but there's in a lot of ways I imagine that men can become dysregulated after these, if they're in an inequitous relationship, like you've been, like you said. And yeah, I imagine that would be a really hard thing to study, because a lot of cases, maybe the men aren't even aware how inequitous it is in some cases.
Totally.
And that might catch them off guard.
Yeah. And especially it makes it so hard too, because if a guy is in the really intense, emotional reaction phase, like we obviously know that the emotional upheaval peaks in the short term afterwards, as does risk of suicide, and then dissipates with time as things settle. But if you try and, go to a guy who's really struggling and is totally blindsided and say, well, maybe if you kind of picked up your act a little bit earlier and actually contributed to your relationship a bit more, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Like, that would be terrible advice. So
Not so helpful, yeah.
Not so helpful at all. And so I think, we just have to be realistic and pragmatic about supporting men's mental health in this context, and really recognize that doing so should not be considered as an excuse for any kind of, poor behavior in a relationship that did break down. I think in my mind, the two can coexist. We can support guys to learn and reflect and grow and, take accountability for potentially their role in the relationship breakdown in some ways, while also recognizing that, they need emotional support to do so. I think one shouldn't come at the expense of the other.
So your sample was of 22 young men between the ages of 19 and 30, I believe?
Correct. Yep.
Mixed race, mixed gender identity, I believe.
All men, but yes, I think there was one trans identifying young man, but yes.
So from relationship loss, what is the process? You've got reacting and recovering. What's the process from there?
Sure. So essentially maybe just to contextualize the method I used to essentially come up with this theory of how young men react to and recover from relationship breakdown. So I interviewed 22 young guys about the kind of process of their breakups and how they got there, how they reacted in the short term afterwards, and then how they recovered from that across time. And grounded theory is the method I use, which is a method of qualitative research that essentially allows you to understand process and change over time in kind of social processes. So how people relate to other people across time, how they relate to themselves and their emotions. It essentially allows you to chart themes in complex processes over time. And so in interviewing these young guys and coding the interviews and kind of coming up with different themes, I went round and around and around to come up with this process, especially the visualization of it, because it was really hard to kind of visualize such a complex piece.
Oh, it's great, by the way. Your figure one is fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. And a lot of time went into that, too much time, but yeah, we got there. But yeah, the initial reaction phase is essentially when emotions were the main base from which everything flowed for participants. So it really seemed as though their entire existence, their day-to-day behavior, everything they were doing was entirely emotionally driven. So they were always kind of reacting to the breakup that they had just experienced. And so the two kind of main initial sub-processes of that reacting phase were what I called mixing emotions and massing emotions. And so the first mixing emotions really spoke to, again, the complex mixing of emotions that took place for all young guys. Which is to say that it wasn't entirely a negative experience for a lot of young guys. Like in some ways, and interestingly, especially if they were the one to end the relationship that they didn't necessarily want to be in, sometimes positive emotions were mixing with negative emotions at the same time. So it wasn't all entirely bad. But having said that, at the same time, some really intense negative emotions can coexist with some relief and positive emotions at the same time. So it's a really complex, interesting mix. And it seemed like for some guys, depending on the day and depending on, whether a memory would pop up and remind them of something with their ex, then they could slip in, from positive relief down into shame and isolation. So it's, a complex kind of oscillation of emotions. And with that as well, the kind of second process is what I called massing emotions, which is really less about the substance of the emotional upheaval and more just the intense weight and the gravity of it. So this process was more when guys were just totally overwhelmed and when things just had totally hit the fan and they just saw no way out and were totally dysregulated. And again, sometimes they could be in mixing emotions. If they're doing okay, they feel like they're moving forward, and then something could, trigger a memory, or potentially they could try and go out and meet someone new, and then all of a sudden they realize how much unresolved emotional pain there is, and all of a sudden then they're overwhelmed and slip into massing emotions. So it was kind of an oscillation between the two. And also what's really important to highlight is where suicidality was mentioned by, I think, 30% of the guys I spoke to, it was in this massing emotions phase, which I think again speaks to the intense emotional overwhelm of relationship breakdown as kind of core to suicide risk for some men. In a lot of ways, I think suicide is sometimes considered a response to emotional pain, but I think, for me, it in some ways shouldn't be considered as separable from or separate from the emotional pain itself. I think suicidality could be considered an emotion in and of itself in some ways. So yeah, they were the kind of two initial processes of mixing and massing emotions. And then with time, as things started to settle and as young men started to kind of move through their experience, The third kind of main sub process in the reacting phase was managing emotions. And so this really spoke to the diverse range of strategies that guys use to kind of regulate and manage the emotional pain that they were experiencing. And so there was three main kind of strategies that I identified. And again, guys would oscillate between them. Some mentioned, some strategies more than others. Some mentioned a mix of all three of the main categories I heard about. But the first was withdrawing, where guys intentionally, in a lot of ways, withdrew from their social supports and networks in order to tend to their emotional wounds in isolation, which, I think in some ways is really healthy that guys, want to have time to themselves to reflect and just want to be alone and, just sit with the emotional pain and really lean into it. I think that is really healthy and important. But it creates a really complex picture when we know that that is the phase at which guys are most at risk of suicide. So how do you know when a guy who is withdrawn is he okay and just reflecting and is doing okay? Or is he withdrawn because he's isolated and he's, intentionally withdrawing because the distress is really escalating towards suicide risk? So that is a really, important, I think, process to delve into in future to try and understand what healthy withdrawal looks like versus unhealthy isolation that might indicate escalating risk of suicide. And so the second main category of managing emotions was distracting, which, as you might expect, some guys really spoke to leaning into drug and alcohol use in order to numb and escape from their emotional pain and really, I guess, rather than withdraw from it, just totally forget that it even existed. Having said that, though, I think there were some really adaptive measures of distracting where some guys spoke about the gym, for example, as being a really important source of distraction and a healthy means of just, recognizing there's nothing they can change about the situation they're in. They just need to give their brain a break from it and just actually move forward somehow. And then the third kind of main strategy of managing emotions was expressing, which is really where guys, particularly like as things started to settle down and maybe they weren't as emotionally overwhelmed, they started to let people in and express, how they were really feeling and how they're really doing after the breakup to some certain people in their lives that they felt safe with whom to do so. So yeah, that was the initial kind of reacting phase, all of that sort of process. And then again, with time, we move towards recovering. But yeah, interested in what's coming up for you guys as I talk through that initial phase.
Well, I'm curious, and this is a male-oriented research, but like I see a lot of not just male sort of behaviors, but like just kind of human behaviors in the reacting aspect of relationship loss. I mean, I guess would it be just not wanting to discuss your pain, your sorrow because you're a man and it's not manly to do so? Or I guess how does it really differ from a woman's reaction to relationship loss?
I was going to say before you answer, I was thinking along the same lines as you, Carlos, and so many of the things that you were mentioning, we started off talking about that traditional, like rigid, stoic man and how antithetical like this mixing and massing emotions and all that sounded to that. So yeah, it follows Carlos's question follows for me. I just wanted to like flesh out a little bit kind of where I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Obviously, I only interviewed young guys, so I can't say for sure how this process, might look different for young women. But I think in a lot of ways, it probably does look quite similar. And I think that is important because, in the broader context of risk of suicide following relationship breakdown, those studies that compare risk in men relative to women actually generally find that risk is relatively equal between the two. So it's not necessarily the case that men are inherently more at risk than women. It's just that potentially different risk factors play a role in that risk, and the pathways to suicide might look different. And so I think, certain parts of this process, I think, would be gendered, especially in terms of the mixing and massing emotions and the kind of socialized difficulty with regulating emotions. I think in some ways that could potentially differ between men and women. Some guys I spoke to did, speak about that exact dynamic that we spoke to earlier in terms of guys relying on their partner as a main source of emotional support, and then all of a sudden they are totally blindsided by the breakup. there was one guy in particular that spoke about his experience of anxiety and how his partner was the main one that helped him realize that he really struggled with anxiety for a long time and was his kind of main source of support. And then through just not necessarily because he was relying on her, but just through a lot of other kind of complex stresses going on in their relationship, he actually decided to end things. And then interestingly, he seemed to be going along okay at first, but then only once he heard that his ex-partner was in a new relationship did he then fully commence this process. So it is interesting in a gendered way in terms of, the lack of recognition of emotional pain until it's like it becomes fully clear that maybe what you were holding on to is actually gone. Now, I think that could be a gendered process as well. But yes, definitely lots more to learn and study in terms of gender differences in this process. But I think in a lot of ways it probably does look quite similar, which I think just speaks to relationship breakdown being an inherently, emotionally distressing experience regardless of gender. I just think there are some elements that definitely interact with the way that we know boys and men are socialized.
Just to lighten things up for a minute, because this subject, Carlos, with breaking up from relationships, when you were reacting, were you more of a withdrawer or a distancer or an expressor?
I was always a run for the hills kind of guy because I did the breaking up usually. So I did as I've talked to Skip before. I've never, and this isn't me like, oh, I'm such a man's man. I've never been broken up with, but I have had a loss in death, and which I kind of associate with the very same. I mean, it's a loss. It's the same sort of pain, and it's
very similar.
So I do understand, the mixing emotions. I do understand massing emotions, and then managing is a whole other uphill struggle. But to answer your question, Skip, I was always a runner.
Would we classify that as distracting? I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. I think I was probably yes. That's probably what I would do.
There's a healthy element of distracting too, right?
Yeah,
It's not.
yeah.
I think the expectation and the stereotype is that, guys never reflect on their breakups. They just like distract and move on. But I think what people actually need is the right amount of balance of all of these different things. Like you can't inherently, reflect and learn and grow from your breakup all of the time through this whole process. I think you need to give yourself a break and actually have times where you just put it out of your mind. Because otherwise you can lean into rumination and you can start to obsess over things.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think if your mind's just going around and around in circles, you're actually keeping yourself locked in a process where maybe if you were to actually distract for a bit, particularly through some sort of adaptive means like exercise, where you can start to feel positive emotions and actually help yourself, then that can actually help you move through the process. The stereotype of the guy that's just completely ignoring things, may not ring true, I don't think.
I see. So I'm a fairly new paramedic, and I see a lot of and it's not the same. It's not obviously a relationship loss, but I see a lot of distracting behavior in a lot of paramedics who are just working like dogs, and I've seen that in like the sort of like mental health type industries, if you will, where they'll work 12-hour shifts and they're constantly working. And yes, pay is good, but like in my armchair sort of psychology, I see that this person is avoiding something. This person is whether it's a relationship or some other issue they're having, but like, I mean, nobody works that much for the pay. Like it's just a distracting behavior, I think. So anyway, just a little aside, but I have noticed that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that came up under distracting too. Like it was one of the main ways that guys initially talked about, giving themselves a break from the emotional pain was just to really focus on work and like just, fully lean into that, which again, I think in some ways can be healthy. But if you're, tipping yourself over into burnout and you're just like, if it's distracting with total avoidance as well, then I think, that creates a risky picture. But if it's distracting when you're then going to come back to it and allow yourself time to reflect and heal, then I think is when it can potentially be healthy.
Well, it's almost like an attempt to rebuild your identity into this new thing. Even if it's not a new thing, it's just like, I'm going to put all my energy into this direction now. And this is me now, whereas this was me before. But that's gone. So I'm going to have to jump onto this What? What were you going to say, Skip?
You just blew my mind. You just blew
Oh.
my mind, Carlos. Yeah, when you said reestablishing your identity, and because what I was thinking about earlier was when I got divorced, I definitely did some distraction, and it was a good divorce for me. We've talked about it before. I have no problem looking back on that one. But like immediately, I did the Mongol rally where you drive a crappy car from Prague to Mongolia, and then I started hiking the John Muir Trail, and it was exactly that. It was like I needed to remind myself or create who I was again because I don't know, it was so what I had just come out of was so antithetical to how I perceived myself. And so I was using heavy amounts of distraction there, but but I think in
Well,
mostly positive ways in that situation. Maybe
yeah,
I'm wrong.
totally. But you're exactly right. Like that, and that kind of leads nicely into the second overall phase that I came up with in terms of recovering. The first main sub process of that was prioritizing self. And really, that is everything you just spoke to, Skip, around piecing your identity back together, figuring out who I am independent of this person and this relationship that has just ended, and really embracing all of those activities that allow you to feel a coherent and kind of collective sense of self. And so for a lot of guys, it was, maybe activities that they had neglected while they were in their relationship. So a lot of guys reconnected with hobbies that maybe they had lost touch with over the course of a relationship. Some guys again spoke about leaning into work if that was a really key source of identity and development for them. So again, some of the same behaviors and activities can come up at different phases of this process depending on the motivation behind it. And again, the main way that the self was prioritized for a lot of guys was, again, stereotypically, but I think it's actually really healthy, was the gym. Everyone pretty much spoke to leaning into exercise in some form as just a real means of like physically rebuilding yourself so that you can emotionally and, in terms of your self-concept, piece it all back together. So yeah, it really speaks to the identity rupture that a relationship breakdown can be, but also the profound opportunity that it presents for some guys in terms of, this overall phase of recovering. I was really blown away by just the extent of growth and learning and emotional development that these young guys talked about off the back of their breakups. Like there was one guy, there's a quote that I love in the paper where he talked about, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on this, but he talked about feeling like a fucking powerhouse now because he was like, I just feel like I've addressed all of the unresolved trauma that I had, all of the emotional regulation issues and fears of abandonment, and all of these really deep-seated, emotional and mental health issues. His relationship breakdown really highlighted all of those issues and kind of brought them to the fore, such that through this process, he was able to identify how to move through that and how to actually learn from it and heal it so that going into his next relationship, he felt ready and equipped to do so. And so that was a really inspiring kind of, positive finding from this research that again just really speaks to the opportunity that breakups can bring alongside, unfortunately, the risk. And again, just speaks to how, in a lot of ways, people might think, to stop this problem of suicide following relationship breakdown, we need to stop relationships from ending. But I don't think that's the case at all. We need to help people end relationships in a healthy way, like teach young people how to do so. For example, there's so much like respectful relationships type education out there that's all about how to form and maintain healthy relationships, but we teach people very little about how to actually end them and how to regulate your emotions in the aftermath, what to expect, what's normal, what's not, particularly for young people who, as you alluded to earlier, Skip, just don't have the resilience, don't have the life experience of these things to know that it's going to be okay. So yes, it was really positive, the identity and the development and the growth that these guys experienced. It was amazing.
So we have prioritizing self. Is reconciling the next step, or is it kind of like fluid, whether or not it could be triaging influences?
Yeah, so the three kind of all interacted with one another, I guess. So the triaging influences piece was really around young men moving towards social supports that they felt could meet their needs and were able to actually validate their emotional pain and respond to it in a healthy way. And really importantly, young guys moved away from social supports that did not resonate with what they needed. And the main kind of narrative that every young man I spoke to was told, but this narrative resonated with no one, was really advice to just get back out there, just go and sleep with someone else as quickly as possible, just move on. Again, everyone heard that. No one resonated with it. It was terrible advice. It was the absolute antithesis of what these guys needed at the time. And I think it really just, in a lot of ways, putting this in context, serves only to reinforce this idea of men, and particularly young men, as somehow emotionally immune to relationship breakdown, and really just reinforces this norm that guys can and should just move on and not feel the pain of a breakup that is just a human experience. So yeah, that was one of the findings that I expected it would come up, but I was surprised at the extent to which it did. Like every single young guy had this sort of advice in some form, but again, it was helpful for no one. I think if there's one takeaway for people listening in terms of how to support guys through a breakup, it's try not to. And I think why this advice sort of comes up so much for people is, again, if you don't know what to say, you potentially lean on what you think is going to be most helpful in just getting him to stop feeling what he's feeling, because it's really uncomfortable sometimes to sit with someone who's really in intense distress and not know what to say. But I think just try and push through that and try not to lean on these dominant kind of narratives or ideas that men can and should just simply move on. Try instead just to sit with that pain and just, say things like, that sounds really hard. I can imagine, how awful you must be feeling, and just like reflect back what you're hearing back to them. You don't need to have the answer. You don't need to solve the problem for them, because in many ways it can't be solved. The relationship has ended. But Brené Brown talks about connection being the main antidote to shame. You can sit in that pain with them and validate it and, respond without trying to get them to stop feeling what they're feeling. So,
I feel like anything else is dismissive, whether they intend it to be or not. It's just, you just say, go hook up. Go find a woman or find somebody to sleep with. It's well-meaning advice, I guess, in most cases, but it's just it's not helpful, and it's just accidentally dismissive. So
exactly, yeah, it was always well-intentioned, but just was felt as a total. One guy described it as a total disconnect. So again, if we're talking about isolation and social disconnection and loneliness as key risk factors for suicide in the context of relationship breakdown, and we're saying that social support is a really important antidote to that risk, we need to be thinking about not only the availability of support and people for guys to turn to, but also the capacity of those supporters to actually respond in a way that meets the guy's emotional needs and actually, helps. It doesn't just, try and get him to stop feeling what he's feeling. So, as much as interventions for guys in this context should focus on men themselves, I think there's a real opportunity to train the people around men in their lives around how to actually respond, how to sit with their pain, how to provide good support, because there's clearly some learning that needs to be done there too.
Yeah, I think what you said before, you didn't say mirroring, but that's just how my brain adapted it. Mirroring back their emotions to it. And I think that's really, really helpful advice, because I've been in situations where I don't know what to say to this person right now, but I shouldn't know what to say. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a sage elder, but just reflecting back to them what they're saying to you is helpful enough, I think, in that situation.
Yeah. And I think you can even say, I've had this situation too, where I just feel like I don't know what to say. So I just say that I don't know what to say, but I can see how much you're struggling right now. And I really I hate how much pain you're clearly feeling. Just say that, just say that you don't know what to say, but you're with them anyway. I think, and I think another piece of advice that often comes up is, and it's sort of, I think it's less harmful than advice to go and fuck someone else, but it still can be considered a little bit dismissive, is the idea that time will heal. You just need to hang in there, you'll get over it sort of thing, which is true. But I think if you're saying that, you need to say something like time will heal and I'm with you until it does, because then that reinforces that, yes, obviously time will heal, but I'm with you in this ride and we'll get through it together sort of thing.
Yeah, like, because functionally, both of those comments are kind of the same. They're both kind of like a person's having some emotional distress, and you're shutting the door on the possibility of a conversation about that, right? You're saying, look, let's not dwell in these emotions. Go fuck somebody, or like time's gonna take care of this. Just shut up. Like, it's like really, it's shutting the door on that conversation, what they need, and I love that idea of just mirroring, because for so many people, especially guys that don't know how to emotionally interact, just saying, just give back to them what they're giving to you, that is
Yeah.
simple enough that people can follow it. If
Yeah.
they don't have the emotional intelligence to do much more, to just say that. And I don't know collectively how much, I don't want to speak for you, but for Carlos and I, who are, in our 40s, how many times we've heard a woman say, I don't want you to say anything, just listen. Like, just like what you said, I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to add. Like, a lot of times people don't want you to add anything. They just want you to
Totally.
be there. Yeah. They just want that
Yeah.
connection that you were talking about. That
Exactly.
all
Yeah.
resonates with me. Are there any other things aside from kind of mirroring that emotions? If we see a man in our lives going through intense emotional distress because of a breakup, or anything else, like, what else do you recommend? Or is this kind of the primary mode to go into?
Yeah, I think in terms of what to say, those would be the main things that I'd recommend. But in terms of what to do as well, I think given we know that opportunities to piece yourself back together through activities and behaviors that give you a sense of self and purpose, you can help create the opportunity for guys to do that. Like if a really close friend of yours has gone through a really intense breakup, but you know that something that he loves doing is, going out hiking, for example, you can be the one to initiate that and to say, I know you might not feel like doing it right now, but we're going to do this. I've put the time aside. Like, take the initiative to actually remove the barriers to entry to a lot of these behaviors that will be helpful for that person. Because I think, for some guys in particular, there's a real reticence to reaching out for support, because we know that anyone going through a breakup, they're going through it emotionally, and some people, who are going through it might not want to. They might feel like they're burdening other people. They might feel like people don't want to hang out with them because they're being a sad sack all the time or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you can, as a supporter, directly challenge that narrative and go, I don't care if we walk in silence for an hour. I just want to do this thing with you because I know that it's something that's important to you, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it right now. I think that can be a really important thing for people as well. And some of the guys I spoke to talked about friends doing that for them. It was often really simple things like just, showing up with ice cream, or booking in time to go and do something, when someone's free because they're just sitting at home sad all the time. It's not like they're particularly busy. So yeah, that's something I'd recommend as well.
Yeah, it's funny that you said ice cream. I was thinking about, when I was younger and going through breakups, and the stereotypical, like, you don't see men breaking up in film or TV or anything like that. So like, when you were going through a breakup as a young person, I was like, I'm going to do the girl breakup thing, and I'm going to have a friend over, and we're going to eat ice cream and watch a movie together. And
yeah,
like,
which
I
is
was
exactly
looking
what everyone should do. Like, you need,
right.
regardless of gender, that is probably what's most helpful. But for some reason, the script has become gendered.
Yeah, you're like what you're saying, but we had to look to like female characters in rom-coms and things to do it.
Yeah, these
So
movies have made what is probably a universally helpful coping behavior, i.e., connection with friends in whatever form. They've kind of implicitly coded it as gendered purely through omission and not
Yeah.
showing depictions of guys doing that in whatever form it might look like. So yeah, pretty negligent omission in my mind from the movies of the early noughties.
I've got one though, and as I was reading your paper, it kept popping up in my head. I'm like, don't bring this up, don't bring this up. But this has come up organically. So, have you guys seen the movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall?
A long time ago.
Yeah, man, you should rewatch
it. Not for a long time, but
especially based on this conversation. Yeah, it's really, really funny, and he is definitely going through it, and it is from a male perspective, and it's very funny. And he gets triaging influences and bad advice, and he does all the withdrawing and the distracting, and all the things that you've got here is represented in that movie, and it's a great movie.
Okay.
Too, so.
Yeah, I'll revisit it. Another thing I'll hit you with a recommendation right back. I don't know if you've read Good Material by Dolly Alderton, because that is her new book. It came out, I think, sometime last year, but is centered around a guy in his, I think, mid-30s who's just been through a breakup, and highlights a really important, I guess, context of a breakup for young guys when all of their friends have kids. And it's at that age where, and again, I spoke earlier about young guys going through this being more at risk potentially because their peers aren't going through the same thing. There's no greater context of that than early fatherhood for some guys where, you might be going through a breakup, but all your friends have kids, so they just inherently don't have the time that you need from them. And it just, is a really complex picture. But I think the book does a great job of exploring the gender dynamics of that and just the nuances and the difficulties of that experience. So, I'd recommend that one too.
Good Material. I didn't catch the name of the Dolly. What was the name of
Dolly Alderton? She's a British feminist author. She's great. It was her first book written primarily from a man's perspective, which I think was controversial to some people, but I think she's clearly interviewed a lot of guys for the book, and I think she nailed it. So it's a good one.
All right, so we got a reading recommendation,
and I'm going to rewatch Forgetting Sarah Marshall tonight.
Yeah. I mean, that is definitely lowbrow and toilet humor, but it's funny. It's funny. It's a funny movie.
When you're researching suicide every day, you need some lowbrow humor every now and then.
Oh, then it's a good one.
I can't imagine. All right, well, so let's just to recap the main thing.
There's still reconciliation. Yeah, is that
reconciliation?
Or was that largely covered with in the trio here?
Yeah, I mean, just as a final point, it was kind of around when guys, and again, not everyone I interviewed had got to this point, but it was really around when they had let go of any remaining emotional pain and kind of had come to terms with their experience and sort of learnt from it and incorporated the learnings and the growth into their day-to-day life. So a lot of guys spoke about, a day where they finally just felt like they weren't angry anymore or they weren't upset anymore and they just had kind of fully healed the experience. So not everyone I spoke to had gotten to that point. People are at different stages in the process, but really encouragingly, a lot of guys were there and were able to talk about the powerful learning and growth they'd experienced. So it was really nice.
I imagine there's different timelines for that. I feel like I've known people that hadn't reached that after decades, and people that were there after a couple of weeks. So
Yeah, totally.
Well, if anyone is interested in your research, where would they find your contact, or where they can download anything? We'll link some to everything that we've got here.
Yeah, I mean, through that, you can also find me on LinkedIn. I post about, different research that we have going on through Movember on there. And that also links to my Google Scholar page that has all of my research on there. And we've got some new research coming out very soon focused on fatherhood and men's mental health, which again is another really important context where relationship problems and relationship breakdown is a real risk factor. So excited to have that one launching very soon. But and if I'm happy for you to put my email in the show notes too, if people want to reach out, always happy to chat.
Oh, and we'd love to have you back. I know that you also wrote a chapter on the Manosphere and young men.
Didn't even talk about that.
We didn't even talk about it. No. So we'd love to have you back on to talk about that and how it's related to this stuff as well.
Totally.
But this was real fun. Fun talking about male suicide as usual.
Definitely happy to come back because there's some really interesting kind of connections there that I'm sorry I've completely forgot about that we didn't get to. But
it's all right.
Yes, next time for sure.
For sure. Well, you've been very generous with your time, and we really appreciate it. It's fantastic to meet you. hopefully we'll be in touch sooner than later, and we'll get to.
Actually, can we ask you one thing real quick before you leave? We do a thing at the end of the show called Joy of the Week. Do you have a joy of the week that you could share with us? Like your joy
Oh,
from the
I
week?
love that. My joy of the week. I'm watching Last One Laughing at the moment. It's a new show that I think there was an Australian version, an American version, and now the second season of the UK one has just come out. So it's essentially a reality kind of game show where 10 comedians are all in a room and they have to try and make one another laugh without laughing themselves. And if you laugh twice, you get eliminated. And it is fucking hilarious. I've never laughed so much at a TV show in my life. It's just phenomenal. Alan Carr is on it, who's like one of my favorite comedians.
Yeah.
Sam Campbell, who's an Australian comedian who is just iconic. So yeah, that is bringing me so much joy this week.
That's awesome. That sounds delightful.
Yeah, it's such a good watch. Highly recommend.
All right, got that in at the end.
But yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's been great. I've loved this conversation. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, that was fun. What'd you think, Skip?
Yeah, I loved it. I think, there were things that were fun talking about personal stuff. There was also some nice, easy takeaways that I really liked, which are, I think, easy for people to implement in their own life, which is if you see like a man struggling, to just kind of be near them and talk to them and be open to listening and mirror some of their emotions and reactions so that it's like kind of a safe place for them to connect. And that seems like such an easy thing to do. And it's another one of these conversations we have with Movember where there's something really dark and they give us a little hope for the future and some ideas with how to deal with these things.
Every time. Yeah, every time. That's I come away with the same thing. Yeah, a big one for me was mirroring, as you were saying, and kind of just the affirming that you don't need to solve someone's problem and you don't need to make it better for them. You just need to be there. You know what I mean? And not to ignore it, but just to be around when someone's going through a hard time, just to be a presence. And I think that's really, really important because I mean, I've had times where I don't know what to say to somebody and I don't know what to do. I would desperately want to help them, but I don't know what to do. And like, you almost make it worse by just running your mouth. You know what I mean? Just shut up and be there.
Show up with a pint of Ben and Jerry's, and a rom-com and a blanket. And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to like be tough like a girl and get through it.
I like it. And that's cool. A little minor joy. We'll just jump right into joys, I guess, if you're okay
All right.
with that.
Jumping for joys.
A little minor joy for me was I'm tickled by the idea of having all these interviews just kind of skittering around the earth. Like you're in Prague, I'm in Canada. Dr. Pete was in Los Angeles, I think, and Matt Capeless was in Massachusetts, and now we have Australia on the map. So it's just fun.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty nice, except when I'm up at midnight to do the do the things. But you know what? I'm a night owl, so it works out just fine.
You are, man. I don't know that I would have been a part of this interview if I had to be up at midnight. That was kudos to you. So what's one or two or three or however many joys you got this week?
All right. So I'm going to go with something real simple, which is that this past week I've been cooking some green curry, chicken and rice and stuff. And I'm just enjoying walking into my kitchen and smelling those vibrant smells and spices, and it smells so nice and warm. And also knowing that, hey, I did that.
Cool.
What's your joys this week, man?
So my sister got me a bird feeder sometime in the winter, and it was a electronic one with like a camera on it because she had one at home, and I was just marveling over it. So she sent me one, and I've just been waiting until it heated up. Did I already bring this up? Did I already say this?
If you did, I don't remember.
It's okay. Hey, it's new.
It's new to me.
It's new to my middle-aged buddy. So anyway, she sent me this bird feeder, and I finally set it up. It's gotten warm enough, and I'm seeing cardinals and like I'm seeing
awesome.
birds. I'm seeing birds that I've seen from far away, and I even have binoculars. That I'm not like a birder or anything, but I like to scope around and I notice birds. And so there's this one blackbird that I noticed, some time ago. And I knew that it had a blue head, but seeing it
Mhm.
up close on the camera, I'm like, wow, that's like really striking looking. It's not just like a normal blackbird with nothing
Yeah.
to really examine, but it has this blue head. It's really, really neat. So anyway, yeah, I'm really enjoying this camera. And then like, it activates whenever my dogs are out there. So if I'm at work, I can check out the app and I can see my dogs and or I
Cool.
can see Jody walking around back there. And yeah, it's fun.
Birds are pretty. Go look
Yeah.
at some pretty birds. Thank you very much for joining us, and special thanks to Michael Wilson, a research fellow at the Movember Institute of Men's Health, specializing in men's health and relationships. Please like, rate, subscribe to the podcast YouTube channel, or recommend us to a friend. Hasta la pasta.